Stick around. This is a really important show. If you have a child in therapy or you're considering therapy for your child on or off the spectrum, today's guest is Stephanie Winn from the podcast You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist, and she'll be talking to us a little bit about the autism and gender confusion connection, as well as how to spot a good therapist, how to find a good therapist for your family. So stick around. This is one that you do not want to miss. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Gabriel Williams, and I'm the CEO of Spectrum Research Group. We are the makers of Neural Balance with Anandinol. If you want to learn what Anandinol does and how it can help restore calm, focus, and sleep to your family, just check us out on our website, neuralbalance.com, and click on the How It Works tab. You can also get support from other parents who are going through similar things by joining our Facebook group or checking us out on our Facebook page and by joining our Facebook group. And of course, when we talk about the things that we think might get us kicked off our normal social media platforms, we do have our uncensored show on Rumble, so you can check us out there as well. So today's guest, I'm really excited about. I've actually been listening to her for over a year. She's kind of given me the courage to start speaking out and trying to give you all some information to help you navigate some of this gender confusion and this trans ideology. Today's guest, as I mentioned, is Stephanie Winn. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. She graduated from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her pre-licensure clinic internship experience took place in California and Oregon and included residential treatment, psychosis, personality disorders, complex trauma, post-hospitalization, foster youth, DHS-involved families, high-risk adolescents, and high-conflict couples. So she definitely brings a lot to the table in this area, and she is the host, as I mentioned, of the podcast, You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. Stephanie, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Gabriel. That's really flattering introduction.
Well, like I said, I've been listening to you for about a year, and a lot of times the guests will impress more than the host, because that's what the host is supposed to do, is kind of take a back seat. But the things that you say, the value that you add to it, and your thoughts and your courage on this subject have really inspired me to try to bring this truth to my listeners as well. So I appreciate you for that. Tell us a little bit about how you went from, because let me make a little assumption here, and I know a little bit from listening to your podcast. You were a little more left leaning in some of these issues when you first got into it, but then as you were in for a while, you started to change your perspective. Tell us a little bit about your journey from budding therapist to speaking out against some of these things.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as somebody who'd always lived on the West Coast and been in certain social circles and had certain interests, it was natural for me to be affiliated with left-leaning or liberal thought processes. But I personally felt like being a therapist helped me mature because I recognized an obligation to understand the world from the perspective of my patients. And so when I was working in settings and with people who had a different perspective on life, I couldn't come at that with a preconceived notion. So I felt like being a therapist working with different populations, including people of all different political, cultural, religious, and economic backgrounds, helped me develop a more mature and nuanced worldview. And I was surprised and disturbed to notice from some of the online discourse in, for example, Facebook groups for therapists, that working in that role was not having a similar impact on my colleagues, that in fact it made them more rigid, more righteous. I discovered the work of Jonathan Haidt. His book, The Righteous Mind, I think is a wonderful resource for understanding the psychology of people's morality and belief systems. And in 2020, I had a lot of time alone to think during the early stages of the pandemic and the lockdowns, a lot of time to consume podcasts and audiobooks, and at the same time to be distant from, some of the people I'd previously been surrounded with. So more time to think independently. And it was during that time that my whole kind of worldview fell apart. I'd already had some reservations about so-called gender affirming care and the way that I was noticing it was playing out in the field, and already had some concerns about the heated political climate around race issues. But it was really eye-opening in 2020, seeing what was happening in my city at the time, Portland, Oregon, around the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, the lockdowns, all of that. And it just got me thinking outside of the box. And through that, that's how I learned about detransitioners. When I had been trained to affirm people's gender identities as a therapist, I was not taught about detransitioners. I was not taught about regret. And so, you're being taught something very counterintuitive, but there's sort of an intellectual humility along with this sort of progressive, accepting, open-minded attitude. Well, who am I to question someone's inner experience? These magical trans people must be having an experience that I can't relate to. But what I realized is that that's actually a failure of empathy, because I actually don't believe that people who call themselves trans are actually any different from you or me. They're still male and female, and they're still suffering the human condition just like all of us. It's just that they've latched onto a particular narrative for the problems in their life. And so I think that to ascribe this magical thinking that they defy the laws of physics, that they know who they are at earlier ages than the rest of us, and that butchering the body is good for them, even though it wouldn't be good for the rest of us. Like, that's actually a failure in empathy, to set aside one's critical thinking and to project this whole different set of rules onto this othered group of people. And what I realized is that trans-identified people are just like you and me, and that they need the same quality of clinical care, including critical thinking and gentle challenging of unhelpful thoughts, that we would offer for any other condition in a clinical setting.
Well, that was one of the things that I thought kind of early on, listening to podcasts and seeing how some of this was playing out. And the thing that alarmed me was the people in charge that you would expect would help people work through this were changing their tune and affirming it. And I said, long ago, a couple of years ago, I said to my wife, would these people tell an anorexic person that they are overweight? Would they suggest that they continue to diet? Would they set them up to have their stomach, lap band surgery? It didn't make any sense to me that rather than trying to help them see reality and become more resilient, they were affirming what was a delusion, to the detriment of the patient. And that was one of the things that really still continues to alarm me. The American Medical Association and all these different governing bodies and associations that teach you and hold you accountable to ethics for your industry are now on board with this. And it makes no sense to me. Like, what do you think it is about this issue that has caused people to, I don't want to say fall for it, because I don't want to, as you mentioned, they're credentialed, intelligent people, but what is it about this issue that causes people to give in and to even entertain the delusion? Do you think? What do you think?
Here's one way that I think about it, okay? I say this as someone who struggles with long COVID. I have for 2 years. I think the spike protein is a genius devil of a particle. It's something that can get into a human being's physical body and exploit any weakness. And anyone who's been negatively impacted by COVID for any significant period of time has the same thing to say about it. They say, whatever weakness I had in my system, it exploited that weakness to the nth degree. You know, for me, for example, my blood pressure was always on the low side. Now it's super, super low and I have to take medication to raise it, right? That's just one of many impacts. And so just like there's this physical virus that can exploit any weakness in our system, so too we live in an age of mental viruses that can exploit any psychological weakness, any social weakness, any breakdown in our society. And so this feels to me like the perfect engineered mind virus to exploit all of our weaknesses, to exploit teenagers' naivete as well as their hubris, to exploit normal developmental challenges, to exploit normal flaws in families, normal communication breakdowns, to exploit the shadow of your average Democrat. And it's the shadow that I feel like I see more and more clearly each day of hubris. It's this mentality that I am smart and righteous and other people are dumb and evil.
Right.
That mentality, combined with a lack of questioning oneself, a lack of questioning, am I actually ascertaining the situation correctly? Do I know for sure that other people are dumb and morally corrupt and that's why they disagree with me on this issue? Or could I actually maybe have the same weaknesses that I project onto other people?
Right.
So it's this hubris that gets exploited too, especially in the enablers. And so in the parent coaching work that I do, which is the main thing that I do now, is working with parents of ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria, young people, we look at all of those weaknesses that the virus is exploiting, whether in the family system, in the psychology of the individual, and in those surrounding them. So, for example, this idea, I am smart, I'm too smart to be fooled, and I am morally righteous, and I have a right to be, to have moral indignation toward other people who are not as righteous as me, and I feel good when I get all pumped up on my moral righteousness. That weakness is so easily exploited. And so a common mistake that parents make, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but a common mistake that parents make is trying to convince their kids, no, you don't understand. I know something you don't know. This is actually wrong, and here's why. Here's the evidence. Just read this report, blah, blah, blah. No. You're not going to get anywhere with that approach 9 times out of 10. There are certain families where that might work, but most of the time that's going to cause them to close down further because there's a deep conditioning to reject anything that would conflict with the belief, I am too smart to be fooled and I am morally righteous, right? So if you're trying to challenge that, say, no, you're being fooled. No, you're on the wrong side of history. You're going to trigger a young person's defenses. So some of the parent coaching I do involves working with rather than against those psychological defenses so that you can get around them. Putting your kid in the position of feeling like you respect their intelligence, and then finding communication strategies to talk about this issue in a way that they feel intelligent and they feel like they are discovering a way that they have been fooled, not that you're trying to make them feel like they've been fooled.
That's very important too, because it's hard for anybody to admit that they're wrong about something. I mean, it's funny because maybe women go through it too, but men go through this period in their 40s and early 50s where we start to realize how stupid we've been for so long about so many things. And some men get depressed, like they feel foolish. It's a hard blow to work through some of this stuff that time and wisdom makes us realize was so foolish from our past. And when you're a teenager and you're thinking about something as serious as gender, and everybody online, your whole, online community is affirming and calling you a hero and brave and all of this, it is hard to admit that you've been fooled. So I think that's very important. What you're doing there is teaching the parents how to communicate, because nobody's going to love your child more than you. Nobody cares more about your child's future than you. So, and your only profit from helping them work through that is to see them do well. So I love that you've started to focus on the parents, and because I hear that time and time again. I mean, I have friends who have adult children who, you know, thought everything was okay. And then they hear from their 30-year-old, I'm transitioning into a woman. I've been on hormone blockers and for 6 months, and I'm already changing. And they don't even know how to talk to them. They're so desperate to try to talk them out of it. And they fall into the same trap, what you just said. And it's funny when you say, because I've even said similar things about other subjects, politics and things like that. Like, oh, you're giving up, you're believing the propaganda, you're watching too much TikTok, and what you're basically saying is you're stupid and you're falling for it. And that's such a mistake. So there's a lot of wisdom in taking a better approach. So that's one of the services you now offer, is coaching to parents to help them talk to their children. So in our show notes, I'll make sure to include links so people know how to get a hold of you to set things like that up, because I think that's very important. So I will definitely put in the show notes so how people can get a hold of you. So one of the things that you're kind of alluding to that I think is important, and I don't see as much, as teaching kids to be resilient rather than affirming every bad thought or every area of depression or every weakness that they have, rather than just affirming it and dwelling on it, living in that. It's important that we teach our kids how to be resilient and work through that. Now, what's a good approach for parents to help them work through that way?
Well, actually, I earlier mentioned Jonathan Haidt. I think he's one of the greatest thinkers of our time. I highly recommend all of his books, including his newest book, The Anxious Generation. And he actually distinguishes between three relationships with fragility. So there are things that are fragile, like glass. There are things that are resilient, meaning not easily broken, like plastic, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are things that are anti-fragile, like trees. So the example is that trees actually need wind. They need that stressor on them in order to grow strong. If you grow a tree inside of a greenhouse where it's never exposed to wind, it'll just fall over. So things that are anti-fragile, like trees, actually require a certain amount of stress in order to become the fullest version of themselves. And so children are not just resilient, they're actually anti-fragile. They need certain amounts of stressors. I think right now we're in an era where our relationship with stress is kind of all over the place, because on the one hand, we feel like our lives are super stressful, busy, chaotic. We're exposed to world news. Kids are, exposed to so much information that can be devastating. They're also exposed to many online threats, and depending on where they live, environmental pollutants, noise pollution, light pollution, things like that. Even if the average American child is more physically comfortable than a child of a few hundred years ago when it comes to our ability to regulate the temperature, provide enough food and clean water, things like that. So it's not to say that children don't have enough stress in their lives, because they certainly do from many angles, but maybe it's the wrong type of stress. John Haidt makes the case that we are overprotecting our children in the physical world and underprotecting them in the online world. I think the burden of so much information of what's going on around the world coming through screens is more than our brains can process, even more than our adult brains can process. What we're equipped to do is to be aware of what's going on in our immediate environment, both our physical and our social environment, and to have a good balance between stimulus coming in and our own output, our own response to that, seeing a problem and then solving it with our own hands, words, and hearts. So what happens when there's this information overload combined with a lack of experience of directly problem solving? This is why volunteering, chores, being outside, gardening, camping, scouting, things like that are so healthy for kids, because you want to have that right balance between exposure to problems and the lived experience of actually solving a problem and building that sense of competence that you get when you solve a problem with your own skills. And competence is the foundation of competence, and these are important ingredients and a sense of identity. And that's what these young people are struggling with, is identity.
And you mentioned COVID too. That threw them for a loop. I've seen a couple of charts of, people identifying, trans identifying, and it blew right through the roof right towards the end of the lockdowns and then after. And I think that a lot of what you're saying, that was a time they were just locked in. The physical demands of life were no longer there for them. They weren't on a real schedule. They didn't have to get up, make their bed, get to school, do these chores. Everything changed. And then they were stuck just feeding themselves all of this scary information. I mean, no matter what you watched or where you went, they were telling us we were all going to die. And, it was just a very scary time for everybody. So that's where the social contagion of this comes in, right? So you have these kids who are depressed, they're feeling out of sorts, their future is now in question. And if they feel out of sorts at all, one of the things that I seem to notice is that there were actually activists preying on that and planting the seeds in them. They may not have had the thought that they were a different gender or whatever, but these seeds were being planted. You feel discontent, you feel unhappy in your own body because you are in the wrong body. So that kind of leads me to a statistic that I heard, and I'll probably get it wrong, but I think I heard you say it too, so you'll know it better than I do. Upwards of 30% of people who are identifying as transgender are also diagnosed as on the autism spectrum. Was that correct?
I've seen different numbers in different places. I think at the Tavistock, don't quote me on this, look it up for yourself, people, but I think at the Tavistock Kids program, which has since been shut down, it was like 48%, if I recall correctly.
Well, and I think there are a lot of people on the spectrum that aren't diagnosed also. I mean, so the number could even be higher. So it's potential up to half of the people that are going through this gender confusion and this transgender identity crisis are on the spectrum. Why do you think it is that that's more, they're more susceptible to this?
Yeah, so this is one of those kind of $1 million questions amongst gender critical or gender concerned therapists. I do think we have some diagnostic overexpansion. We've seen rising rates of autism. To what extent is that because we've blurred the lines, overexpanded the diagnosis, or to what extent are rising rates of autism due to factors like later maternal and paternal age, neurotoxins from our modern lives, using screens as babysitters? I really don't know. There's a whole lot of factors. However, one thing I think is interesting is that some of the same environmental pollutants that have been associated with autism, particularly ones derived from plastics, are also implicated in endocrine disorders.
Right.
And I, as much as I will talk about social contagion day and night, I don't think we're talking enough about the environmental pollutant factor. If you look at, for example, the research of Dr. Shanna Swan, testosterone levels and sperm counts have declined like 50% in the last 50 years. There's atrazine in the water that is causing frogs to engage in homosexual behavior that is not found in frogs not exposed to atrazine in the water. Endocrine disrupting chemicals impact brains and behaviors. And, there's, I think another thing we don't talk enough about is the impact of birth control on women's psychology and mate choices, things like that. I'd be interested actually to see how it's impacted the divorce rates in women who chose their partners when they were on birth control and then went off of it and found themselves not attracted anymore. So there is a lot to be said for the environmental angle. It's just my position on that is if there are actually endocrine disorders or, we see higher rates of PCOS in the females who present also with gender dysphoria and autism. So we have these endocrine disrupting chemicals, many of them linked to plastics and pesticides that seem to correspond with autism and gender dysphoria. And my thought is, if there is some kind of sign that someone has some type of problem with their endocrine system, does that mean that we should mess it up more? Are cross-sex hormones a solution? No, I don't think that's a solution. I think we need to take responsibility for how we've polluted the environment and understand that people's bodies are affected and their brains and behaviors are affected, but that doesn't mean we need to confuse and pollute things further. That is just one component of things. I think your question was the autism, and I think that's just one side of things. Can you repeat the question, though? Because I want to talk about the other parts.
Basically, do you think there's something that makes people on the spectrum more susceptible to this gender dysphoria or gender confusion, or even more susceptible to trans activists who are kind of grooming people online?
I think a couple other major factors is the obsessiveness, fixation, black and white thinking, and then the sense of shame, the sense of feeling different, feeling like you don't belong. And that can be so painful because an autistic young person who never felt like they fit in, never felt like they were accepted, like they were picking up on other people's cues, especially for girls who felt like they didn't know how to play all the catty social games of other girls, or boys who felt like they didn't have the same interests as other boys. There is something very appealing about the story. It's not because there's something wrong with me. It's not because I'm inherently unlikable. Lots of people in their youth have a sense of feeling different or not fitting in, being bullied or excluded. Those feelings of rejection are painful for everyone, but I do think that they occur more in kids who are on the spectrum or have those traits, whether diagnosed or undiagnosed. And that can create a lot of shame and feelings of inadequacy. So it's really appealing to have a narrative that steps in and says, it's not your fault. It's just that you were born in the wrong body. And then you get to claim this protected class and sort of inflict on others that they must affirm and accept you. It's like instant social acceptance and protection from bullying all of a sudden. So that can be really appealing. And from my work talking to parents of autistic kids, because a lot of the parents I work with, not all of them, but their kids are on the spectrum or have those traits, they're really socially naive. They can't tell when others are uncomfortable with them. There are boys who look every bit of them looks male, but they're wearing like a padded bra with a baggy hoodie over it. And they think that because their hair is long and they're dressed like that and they say their name is Sophie or whatever, that they really think that people see them as female and they can't read people's cues of how they're just kind of placating. So I think it's the naivete plus the shame and all of these factors, as well as the rigid thinking.
Well, and also, I mean, I've seen it just from some of the videos that have been shared and research that I've been doing. Once a kid could be different, quirky, whatever, relentlessly bullied. The minute they go, wait a minute, I think I'm gay, or I think I'm in the wrong body. I was born male, but I think I'm female. Everything changes. You're a hero. You're so brave. Now you're part of a community and you're being accepted. And that's a big leap, I would imagine, for some of these kids. So it makes sense that they would gravitate towards something like that. But something too that concerns me is, as I've seen more and more talk of people taking advantage of that and planting the seed. So, it's in this day and age, it's almost impossible to get away from the phone and the tablet. I mean, our youngest, he's 19 now. We were adamant that he wouldn't have a smartphone until he was 16. But then when we took him for orientation for 6th grade for middle school, the teacher said, and for those of you who are holding out on getting your kid a smartphone, I hate to tell you, but they have to have one because we do assignments and we take tests and all of that. And if they don't have their own, they have to use a pad off the media cart. And well, how how that is to be the only kid in the class who has to use the item off the media cart that the school supplies because you don't have your own. So they almost create this sense of embarrassment and shame if the kid doesn't have a smartphone. Well, now you've handed them probably the worst thing you can hand a developing young mind is access to the whole internet. I mean, it's so ugly as it is. So what can parents look for? How can they tell if, is there a way they can tell if maybe their kid is being targeted by some of these trans activists who are trying to convince them that they're trans or whatever, and pull them in a direction that maybe they weren't even thinking of?
Well, first of all, let me just acknowledge, I think that's really terrible that the 6th grade teacher said that. And it's incredibly
in front of all the kids too.
Yeah, super manipulative. And we have a 6th grader and he doesn't have a smartphone. He has one of those Gab watches, but he has that experience. Like so many of his peers have phones. And, Jonathan Haidt, I'm just going to keep coming back to his work because he talks about the opportunity cost that when you have a phone at recess and lunch, you're staring at your phone instead of being sort of forced like we were back in the 90s to figure out how to socialize with your peers and in the process navigate social interactions, overcome social anxiety, deal with peer conflict and crushes and all that kind of normal stuff that you need to go through during that window of time. And I want to also make sure to use this opportunity to recommend his book, The Anxious Generation, as well as to recommend Miriam Grossman's book, Lost in Trans Nation, which is probably the best book I've read on this subject for parents, and has some useful appendices, which include one on various options for software monitoring, dumb phones, and things like that. So if you give your kid unfettered access to the internet, one way I heard it put recently is you're not giving your kid access to the world, you're giving the world access to your kid. Now, downstream of that, your question is sort of downstream of that, which is if you've given the world access to your kid, what are some signs that nefarious actors or just bad content fed by the algorithms is reaching your kid? Personality changes, your kid becoming zombie-like and repeating thought-terminating cliches, slogans that they can't back up and then angrily storming out of the room. When you confront them, being moody, isolating themselves. Now, some of this is normal, wanting more privacy, and going through mood swings is part of any adolescent's life. But we see this to a greater degree in kids who are becoming indoctrinated, changes in their personality, interests, the way they dress, who they're spending time with, and things like that. And I often say to parents that parents, by the time they reach me, they're very worried about their kid. And I almost always observe what I call a trifecta, the perfect storm of trans ideation, social justice ideology, and personality changes. They almost always go together. And so in order to effectively reach your kid, you really have to understand the psychology of all three aspects of that triangle.
And that's something that you offer during your coaching, your parent coaching, right? How to recognize that, how to deal with that. Mm-hmm. And it almost seems like, too, there's, they say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I almost feel like if I had a resource like you when my kid was maybe 10 or 11, that would give us the opportunity to learn these things ahead of time and kind of cut it off at the pass, because, hindsight's 2020, but looking back, I'd rather have my kid a little embarrassed over using something off the media cart than the stuff that has been fed to him. And not that he's off the chain or anything like that, but we did have a little bit of a patch where, because of COVID, he was depressed and he was anxious. And I think a lot of parents too, we didn't realize, we should have. I mean, we were very naive not to think of this, but here he's locked in his room doing Zoom school all day on the computer. It's only natural that he's jumping around the internet doing other things and communicating with other kids and things like that. So when you look at your spouse and go, where is he getting this? Well, that's where he's getting that, is, he's being fed this by the internet. So I wish I would have had a resource like this. And it's a shame that we usually wait till something's wrong before we seek help. When I wish that more of us would pick up, like, one of the things, women, a lot of times when they find out they're pregnant, they buy that book, What to Expect When You're Expecting. Well, you should read What to Expect When You Have Teenagers before you have teenagers, right? Because those are tools that you need to know to help prevent a lot of problems.
I think that's a really important point. We have 9 and 11-year-olds, and we have a salt shaker that identifies as pepper. I don't know if you've seen me post on social media about this.
That's hilarious, yes.
So it's just like a clear spice container with what's obviously plain white table salt in it, but it has a little cap that says black pepper. So this is one of our jokes around our household. This salt identifies as pepper, but everyone knows what it tastes like. Everyone knows, what's really in the container. And so this is just one of the ways that we're doing that inoculation up front with the younger kids. And I appreciate what you're saying about prevention. And, shifting from doing marriage and family therapy to taking a pause on my therapy practice and only doing parent consultations right now, and parent coaching. It used to be the case as a marriage counselor that people would come to me and it's like, oh, I wish you'd come to me 2 years ago. I could have helped you back then. Now you're really in hot water on the edge of divorce. I don't know how much we can do to turn the ship around.
Right.
And I'm in a similar position now with the parents coming to me where it's like, if only we'd gotten started sooner. I'm going to do my best to help you, but a lot of it's like damage control because they've made what might to some people seem like obviously wrong moves, but oftentimes these parents are intelligent, thoughtful, good parents, good communicators, and it's just that they don't understand the nature of the beast that they're dealing with. Many parents come to me saying, I feel like I have a PhD in this stuff because they've read all the books, listened to all the podcasts, but where I specialize is understanding the psychology of how this stuff affects people and how what you have to do in order to be able to reach them. It's really tricky. And so parents do things that would seem reasonable enough, like giving their kids scientific articles. It's like, no, bad idea until you understand the psychology of what you're dealing with. So I do a lot of damage control, a lot of like cleaning up bad decisions that they've made. And I wish that they would come to me sooner. And honestly, my favorite attitude to see from parents, yes, I understand it sounds very self-serving when I say this. There's no way around that. But my favorite attitude is I'll do whatever it takes. I don't care about the money. And I've had wealthy families say that, but I've also had middle income families with the same financial stressors as any other American family come to me saying that, because when you're worried about your kid potentially destroying their future health, like there's nothing more important than getting them out of that crisis. And when you're ready to fully commit to the process of doing whatever it takes to get your kid out of that, that's where you see the best results. Right. Unfortunately, it's hard for a lot of families to maintain hope. And so some families drop out a little too early, and we haven't gotten them through the woods yet. And that's always hard to see.
That's a shame. Well, I know you have a time constraint. I do appreciate you being with us today. So I want to respect your time and your next appointment. Do you have anything that you want to add, any upcoming book or works or anything you want to promote real quick before we let you go?
Oh, sure. Thank you for that. Yeah, I am not working on a book yet. I've started and stopped with that. But I do have a podcast. I continue to release episodes weekly. So you can find that anywhere you get your podcasts. It's called You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. The website for that is sometherapist.com. My handle on X, which is the main platform I use, is sometherapist. And then the other thing to be aware of is that if I can help you as a parent, I offer free initial consultations, and then I do individual work as well as I am starting a group soon. I'm not sure if this will come out in time for people to join this group or maybe join the next cohort. But you can find more information about that at stephaniewinn.com. So the easiest way to get in touch with me is just you go to stephaniewinn.com, click book a meeting. And from there, you can either get a free 15-minute discovery call, or if you feel like you really need a full consultation with me right now, you can just go ahead and pay for an hour or more or less than that. And that's the best way to get in touch with me. I think that's about it. Oh, and our film, of course. I know we didn't get to that, but it's called excuse me. It was called Affirmation Generation. It's actually now called No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care. And that can be found at nowaybackfilm.com. And you can use my promo code sometherapist for a discount on that.
Okay, good deal. And we'll put links and all of that in the show notes, the description, so people can find it easy enough. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you. I appreciate all of the work that you've been doing. You have great guests. I've been a fan of the podcast for a little over a year, and I appreciate that. It's been motivational and gave me the courage to start talking about some of this too. So I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you, Gabriel. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me. And it sounds like you're doing great work as well.
Thank you. You have a great day. Stephanie mentioned she does have a podcast. You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. Great. She's doing great work. A lot of great subject matter. Super for parents. I can't impress upon you enough that you want to get ahead of this stuff. Our kids are exposed to so many things on the internet that we just don't have any idea about. So you want to get ahead of this stuff. And if you have a kid who's going into middle school, or you're even seeing some of the telltale signs of some confusion or depression, definitely give Stephanie's website a click so that you can get in touch with her and take advantage of some of that coaching and training that she has for parents. And don't forget to subscribe, like, tell your friends, share this show and our channels. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, please share. And we appreciate you. If you have any questions about our products, Neural Balance with Anandinol, you can check us out on neuralbalance.com, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. So thank you for watching this episode of the Spectrum Report.
We're clapping and rejoicing because she's learning how to walk again. She literally stopped walking. So it was a big deal that when I seen her take a couple steps up the stairs, I knew that it was working. It was helping her, because we weren't doing anything else besides teaching her sign language and using Neural Balance for probably the first 6 months.